Hello Mzansi, welcome back to another episode of Farmers Inside Track. My name is Duncan Masiwa and I'm your host for this episode, powered by Wine and Agricultural Ethical Trade Association, also known as Wieta. Now in this episode, we're digging into the Black Producers Support Program. And of course, we're exploring how it aims to close long-standing equity gaps in the wine sector. Joined by Liane Langeveld, who's the Manager of Operations and Strategic Programs at Wieta, as well as Phil Bowes, the Manager for Inclusive Growth Strategy at South Africa Wine. Of course, Phil is joining this conversation to add some perspective on the role of ethical trade and Wieta certification in unlocking market access for Black-owned wine brands. Liane, it's lovely having you join the Farmers Inside Track podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Duncan.
Lovely having you here. Liane, for those who might not know Wieta well, briefly explain, I suppose, your core mission and also a bit about how the Black Producers Support Program actually fits into that vision.
Thanks, Duncan. So for those who don't know, Wieta is a multi-stakeholder that represents both the interests of trade unionists, civil society groupings, wine brands, and of course their producers. The organization also promotes fair and decent working conditions, which is done through capacity building and strategic initiatives. And then in addition to that, we provide a platform for dialogue around ethical trade and of course human rights issues. And then additionally, Wieta's mandate follows an audit assurance system, which of course incorporates external third-party audits to assess and evaluate the auditee member organizations' adherence and compliance to the Wieta standard. And then moreover, the social audit assurance further promotes transparency and traceability in a member organization's operations and supply chain. And then of course holds the organization accountable for its social ethical impact. So just in a nutshell. The vision, of course, is to promote fair treatment, sustainable livelihoods and dignified lives towards equitable and diverse and inclusive agriculture, which obviously speaks to the importance of promoting transformation in the industry. And then, of course, having said that, we implement strategic programs based on the latter, focusing on social dialogue, decent work, human rights due diligence, and of course, transformation, which obviously speaks to the Emerging and Black Producer Program. So basically, the objective of the program is to assist with opening pathways of opportunity for those previously excluded from the wine economy. And it also aims at assisting with compliance and remedial-based support and assists with the implementation of better labor, occupational health and safety and ethical practices for Black producers and, of course, Black-owned brands.
Phil, lovely having you with us. Welcome to Farmers Inside Track.
It's always a pleasure, Duncan. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Let's maybe start off with, when we talk about ethical trade and certification, they're often seen as powerful tools for market access, especially in markets where consumers and buyers are increasingly values driven. Now, in that context, how does Wieta certification specifically help Black-owned wine businesses unlock new export opportunities or achieve, I suppose, price premiums, and what have been some of the tangible outcomes so far?
Duncan, that's a brilliant question, and often producers would like to see premiums, but I think premiums are hard to come by. We've had some recent research around premiums, and it turns out that BEE wines are the only certification that have demonstrated premiums in the past year or so through the research from someone by the name of Britta Niklas. But back to ethical certification, markets want to be assured that they are not purchasing from risky suppliers. So there have been many cases where there's been embarrassment in the retail space overseas, where news reports have come up of unfair labor practices. So when it comes to organizations such as Wieta tries to ensure that there is a standardized convention of codes of good practices that are aligned both with local laws and with international conventions to make sure that those who are buying our product are assured that people were treated fairly. Now, back to the point about a premium, unfortunately, you seldom see a premium with certification. However, a premium is definitely the ticket to play. So we had an example during COVID, for example, where one of the cooperative wineries was struggling for cellar space. One of our black producers was not able to supply product to that cellar because the seller elected only to purchase from Wieta certified suppliers, given their shortage of space because of the surplus of wine. At that time, of course, as you and the listeners will know, wine sales were banned for periods of time. And we assisted this producer to become Wieta certified fairly quickly. Wieta, the winery, ourselves, and the Department of Agriculture Western Cape all banded together to make sure that within each of our mandates, we managed to fund all the corrective actions that needed to be funded on the farm. And we saved their opportunity to supply into that cellar. It was in the order of R500,000 that they saved. Otherwise, they would have had to have diverted their grapes elsewhere. So when we talk about risk, it's not just a risk to the reputation of the retailers overseas. It's also the risk to the producers with their market access. And then we talk about the risks experienced by communities who find their employment in these businesses. So where those risks intersect is where Wieta skillfully plays to make sure that there are standards in place that those who have Wieta certification help assure all three of those stakeholders, whether it's the market, whether it's the communities that find their employment on the farms or in the cellars, or whether it's the wineries, where those risk mitigation measures can converge is where you typically find a certification program.
Liane, you talk about opening pathways of opportunity, and I've seen some fantastic Black-owned wine brands coming into the market. How many Black-owned wine brands have participated in this program?
So basically to date, we've had 16 producers or brands that have participated, 14 of which were successfully audited and are now Wieta accredited, and then 2 will be going into the audit soon.
Absolutely fantastic work that is being done in South Africa's wine industry. Also looking at the work that Wieta is doing. I suppose beyond Wieta certification, Phil, how do you think real transformation can actually be measured?
Well, in South Africa, very often we ignore the convention of measurement in a similar vein to conventions around Wieta measurement or fair trade or any of the other ethical assurance measures. There you have conventions on how precisely what constitutes a certain element. In a similar vein, in agriculture, you have the Agri-BEE codes. Those are enacted into law, and those are the things by which you have wineries and farms and any other enterprise within the wine value chain. They are measured according to that. Unfortunately, we do not yet have a collated set of the aggregate scores of the enterprises in the wine industry. And that's typically how you would want to measure transformation. So transformation is different in the eyes of different people. That's why you need a standard multi-stakeholder accepted measurement and means and methods to do it. And at present, transformation's most reliable measurement is BEE scorecards at the enterprise level. That what we need to do is to begin to aggregate those scorecards and to expand the implementation of the Agri-BEE policy across the sector.
I know that there are some impressive Black-owned wine producers, wine owners that are coming into the market, and we're seeing amazing wines being produced. You obviously much more closer on the ground with some of the structural or institutional barriers that exist, and maybe talking a bit about that. What are some of the biggest structural or institutional barriers that exist that hinder Black producers from succeeding?
Each stakeholder group tends to have its position on what the most important issue is that's hindering this. So you'll have prospective Black producers who would state their greatest challenges, and then you'd have what we call in BEE terms the measured entities for BEE, which is wineries and the likes. and they'll have their opinion on what the barriers might be. And then the government has their opinion. So it's a kind of a three-way nexus, right? So you've got different positions and opinions on what these barriers are. If I were to distill them from our vantage point, the most commonly shared barriers are the cost of getting into business. That's the first one. The second one is that the wine industry is a very path-dependent traditional industry. So it tends to follow patterns, whether it's from practices or ethnicity or whatever it will be. And people find themselves struggling to get into those systems, patterns, or tribes, if you want to call it that way. That's the second point. And the third point, which is crucial to understand, is as much as one sees what appears to be a fairly opulent wine industry cluster when you drive through the winelands, profitability has been a challenge over quite some time. So the number of vineyards are reducing significantly, very, very quickly. So as an industry body, we try to assist people into an industry that is shrinking. So you have to be smarter about how you do that, because there obviously are still opportunities with a shrinking industry, but one's got to take a lot of care to make sure that if you're ushering in new people into the industry, that they know precisely what the risks are going to be and that they're not purchasing something that somebody is trying to get out of in a shrinking industry.
Liane, with any initiative or with any program, there's bound to be a few challenges. What have been some of the common programmatic challenges that you guys have identified?
I think from a programmatic stance, Duncan, funding to a certain degree seems to be a common challenge. As an organization, we'd like to do more for our Black and emerging producers and brands in terms of sustainability. And when it comes to continuous support, we would like to offer a more comprehensive supportive package or ways of assisting and making provision in all areas where required. And that obviously comes from funding. That is one of the programmatic challenges that Wieta faces with the implementation of the program. We are currently conducting some roadshows to check in with our participatory Black producers, the 16 that I've mentioned. And from the visitations, we can acknowledge that market access is another challenge that they face. Markets tend to stick to what they know, is what one of the producers said, and their requirements are very specific and forever changing, which becomes problematic for the Black-owned brand or producer. Another challenge that we've gathered, or a trend amongst the Black producers during our roadshow, was that funding in general seems to be an ongoing challenge for Black producers and Black-owned brands. I mean, if you look at the sustainability of their businesses, if you look at common challenges like housing problems, infrastructural changes, access to funding or adequate funding seems to be a common challenge amongst them.
I've seen a few amazing initiatives coming that seek to support Black producers and Black-owned wine brands. Maybe talk to us a bit about how can programs and initiatives be developed to create and forge better impact for Black producers and Black-owned wine brands.
I can just speak for ourselves. We have pivoted as SA Wine from being a kind of a funder and looking like a funder and communicating like a funder to being more of a collaborator with those with more funds than we have. So very often brands and farms will decry the issue of not having sufficient funding, which is a legitimate point. We've been successful in raising funds from various places as SA Wine, Department of Economic Development and Tourism, the European Union with what they call the Development Cooperative Instrument, which is a transformation wine and spirits fund, which they recently launched. We have a decades-long partnership with the Western Cape Department of Agriculture. We have an agreement with Land Development Services, or LDS, which is the Department of Rural Development Land Reform. And we have a strong partnership with Edge Growth in partnership with FNB and several others as well. So what we effectively try to do is to ensure that partners who have access to funding and programs get influenced by us as the wine industry to onboard some of our clients. In other words, if you have an incubator, we wish to see you accommodating some of our clients. We found if we operate in that way, we can afford people a broader purse, a broader offering, and then more professional hands on what they're doing. So as much as SA Wine has its own grant program for brands and farms and its own training program, we also tap into partnerships, and many of these partnerships are fairly new. We've forged them actively over the past 18 months, and it's all about the brands. It's all about the farms. The focus wouldn't be on us as a priority. The focus is to ensure that their businesses can flourish in this difficult environment.
Liane, are there any unique trends and milestones, I suppose, that you can share with us?
Sure, and very happy to. In terms of milestones from the roadshows that we've now started, one of the producers is actually in the process of establishing a site where she'll have a tasting room and a restaurant. So that's quite an achievement for her. She's not had a farm. She has a brand, and obviously she's been struggling to get a site. And then another reported that the exports have increased by 40% this year, which I think is a great achievement. One of the other producers attained the 2024 honorary award of SA Wine Harvest for inclusivity and diversity. So that I think deserves celebration. And then that very same producer reportedly launched their new rosé. So these are just some unique milestones for the producers that we've gathered during our roadshows, which I thought would be great to just sort of advocate on their behalf. When it comes to trends, Duncan, perhaps if I could say, it's very evident that most of these producers encourage community development, which is very dear to my heart. As we know, poverty is aligned to structural determinants to social inequity, and to break the cycle of poverty, which is a system that generations are born into, is extremely hard. Many of these producers have built their brand and in many unique ways assisted in alleviating the vicious cycle of poverty in their specific communities. I think that is just amazing. It's remarkable to have witnessed and also to see that their commitment to changing mindsets amongst community members has also been amazing. Just to give you an example, there's a Black producer that employs women only from the community, and this is done to ensure empowerment and personal growth and development for women on farming communities. Opportunities are given to disadvantaged people from rural communities to better themselves. So many of these Black producers have the very same vision. There's one Black producer that runs a vegetable garden since 2014 to educate workers on eating healthy and learning about nutrition. I think that's very preventative in nature if you think about public health and systems and policies around public health. There's a Black producer that assists children in respect to finishing school in their communities. Another established a foundation to run a food program for school-going children in lower socioeconomic communities, another game changer. And of course, we've got a Black producer that runs an NPO to upskill young people from farming communities who basically have an interest in hospitality and agriculture. And the funding is then provided to access tertiary education and then further their skills training so that they can be integrated in the hospitality sector as well as agriculture. So these are all game changers and all initiatives that these Black producers have done whilst building their brand, which I think is really amazing. So while lots of focus is on job creation and skills training and feeding schemes, what I find important is that mindsets are changed when these opportunities are provided for. In my opinion, when mindsets change, the pathway to alleviating poverty would have already been established. I mean, many of these producers come from these communities themselves. They have truly been game changers in assisting and combating structural determinants to poverty and social inequity, of course, rather than focusing on behavioral determinants such as social ills, which are common. It's just been amazing to walk this journey with them. To them, it's not just about their wine brand. It goes beyond transformation for me. They've literally just taken their communities with them, and they've literally shown what success looks like and tried to change mindsets in this regard, which I think is absolutely amazing.
Phil, we've talked about some of the barriers that hinder Black producers from succeeding, and you've mentioned the cost of getting involved and, sort of path of tradition that exists in South Africa's wine industry, and of course, profitability as well. If you could change one thing overnight to better support ethical Black-owned wine businesses, what would it be?
I think if I could change one thing, it would be to increase the repeat purchases of premium wine. And the reason for that is, I don't know if many people are aware that most bottles of wine where the producer has managed to develop a premium or a super or an ultra premium product, whichever price tier they're working on, they're selling to an experimental buyer. So you might get to a point where you're supplying into an industry and you are optimistic about the prospects about your brand, only to find that you have to promote to a new customer every time. So if we could get repeat purchases, I sincerely believe that that would grow the culture of loyalty towards these Black-owned brands. And if we could grow the loyalty to the Black-owned brands, we'd be realizing their vision. Because many businesses approach us for advice, and in their minds, they really believe that they can cultivate a loyal, captured audience. And they're confident that their story and their product can do that. And I find that the nature of the wine industry is such that often you get these experimental clients or customers, and they'll try something new, but then they'll pivot to something else within a week or within 2 weeks. If we could cultivate loyal client bases who understand the support of a brand consistently, then I think that would help new businesses stay the course, and then their dream, their initial vision of capturing, a loyal client base that they grow a strong relationship with, who comes back and buys more, who comes back and turns them not just into a good vintage, but into a pedigree brand, which is different from just a vintage, right? A pedigree brand wins stickers. Then I think that's the one thing that I would change.
Well, there you have it. Liane Langeveld, Manager of Operations and Strategic Programs at Wieta. Of course, also joined by Phil Bowes, the Manager for Inclusive Growth Strategies at South Africa Wine. You can, of course, read more on this conversation by visiting www.foodformzansi.co.za. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss any of the episodes. From me, Duncan Masiwa, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #Team Food for Mzansi, thanks for listening.